7. Luke chapter 7, we'll read verses 11 through verse 17. And it came to pass the day after that he, Jesus, went into a city called Nain. Many of his disciples went with him, and much people. Now when he came nigh to the gate of the city, behold, there was a dead man carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and much people of the city was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and said unto her, Weep not. And he came and touched the bier, and they that bare him stood still. And he said, Young man, I say unto thee, arise. And he that was dead sat up, and began to speak. And he, Jesus, delivered him, the son, to his mother. And there came a fear on all, and they glorified God, saying, that a great prophet is risen up among us, and that God hath visited his people. And this rumor of him went forth throughout all Judea, and throughout all the region round about. The first 17 verses of this chapter record two miracles of Christ. These two miracles took place at what is known as the Galilean ministry of Christ, which was simply a traveling ministry going from town to town throughout the region of Galilee. In verses 1 through 10 of Luke chapter 7, you have the record of Christ healing a centurion's servant in the town of Capernaum. And in our text, you see Jesus raising to life the son of a widow woman. These two miracles, very different. The one involves the servant of a Gentile. The one we just read about involves what is probably a Jewish family. The one, the healing of the centurion, was solicited by the centurion. The other is unsolicited. No one asked Jesus to do anything in the one that we just read. In the case of the centurion, Jesus heals without even seeing the sick servant. No touch of the hand. And in the other, the one we just read about, Jesus comes, he sees, and he touches. The one, the case of the centurion, involves sickness. The other, of course, goes beyond sickness to death. Two entirely different set of circumstances. Two entirely different people. Two entirely different set of needs. And so it is with the miracles of Christ. They cover a wide spectrum of circumstances, of people, of needs. And that teaches us not to limit Christ to certain circumstances, to certain people, to certain needs. And that is a tendency of humanity. And it teaches us that Christ is able, no matter what the circumstance, no matter what the people, no matter what the need. You see, the wide spectrum of Christ's miracles teach us that Christ is who he is, regardless of circumstances, regardless of people, regardless of need. And that he is the answer regardless of circumstance, people, or need. So the recorded miracles of Christ and their variety are designed to reveal to us the person of Jesus Christ. It tells us much about who He is. They are also for the purpose of showing us that He is God. He's the Almighty One. He's the Omniscient One. He's the Lord of all. He's the one who is superior to and beyond all and above all. He is the one and only way to God. The only deliverer, God's remedy. Again, regardless of circumstances, regardless of people or need. The recorded miracles of Christ are designed to reveal to us the inconceivable power of Jesus Christ. The universal scope of His government. The infinity of His fullness. And certainly the immensity of His ability. The recorded miracles of Christ are designed to show what a difference Jesus can make in the life of any individual. They show us the transforming power of Christ. Now in verse 11, in our text, we see it as the next day. It is the next day. The centurion's servant has been healed, and it is the next day. The next day following the healing of the centurion's servant. And we read that Jesus and many of His disciples and much people have come into a city called Nain. And it was here that we read of this miraculous event involving a widowed mother and her son. And what happened that day at the gate of the city, involving Jesus, involving this widowed mother, involving her son, should be of great encouragement to us. It should provide us hope. And it really is a theme of praise. So I want to speak this morning on Jesus and a widowed mother. This event, like all Christ's miracles, is monumental. It's something wonderful. It's something marvelous. It's a magnificent illustration of the great wonder of Jesus Christ. So let's look at what took place on that day. Again, in verse 11, it's the next day. And Jesus and many of His disciples and much people. There's a distinction here between His disciples and much people. They have come into a city called Nain. In verse 12, we see Jesus and those following Him are nigh to the gate of the city. And at the same time, there was another procession. We read there in verse 12, "Behold, there was a dead man carried out of the city." Carried out. Being carried out of the city of Nain. The only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and much people of the city was with her. So we have two processions here. One following a widow woman out of the city to the cemetery. It's a funeral procession. And the other following Christ into the city. And these two processions that are so vastly different, the circumstances are so different, they meet at the gate of the city of Nain. And our text explains what happened as these two processions meet. The scene is painted in verse 12. And when he came nigh to the gate of the city, behold, there was a dead man carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and much people of the city was with her. Again, it's a funeral procession. Don't think of the funeral procession here so much. Well, never mind. It's a funeral procession. It's a line of people weeping and mourning because of the death of a loved one. It is a scene that is marked by sadness. It is a scene that is marked by grief, distress, and pain. Luke says that there was a dead man carried out. So his body would have been wrapped in grave clothes. We read in verse 14 that he was carried upon what is called the bier, a wooden plank, a casket, how you and I would consider it, but just in those days, just a wooden plank. We also learn from verse 14 that he was a young man. He was a young man. Looking back to verse 12, we are also told that he was the only son of his mother. So there's this line of people. Some in the front of the bier. There are those carrying the bier. And then the vast majority would be following from behind. It's just like when you arrive at the cemetery, it's the same thing. Usually you have the family in front, then you have the casket, and then the majority of people are following behind the casket. So there's this line of people. They're on their way to the cemetery to entomb this man. And we are told again of his mother that she was a widow. She was a widow. In other words, she had been this way before. This isn't the first time that she has walked this path. She had walked this same lonely, and though there's people with her, she's basically unaware of it. She's alone in her mind. She's walked this same lonely path upon the death and funeral of her husband. And on this day, she's doing the same thing again. Only this time, it is her son. This time, it is her only son. We imagine that she loved him. She loved her son with the special and unique love of a mother. A love that is intense and unwavering, sacrificial, patient. So you see her there. She has no doubt the tender and caring heart of a mother. But on this day, her heart is aching. She's greatly pained, overwhelmed and overcome with sorrow distress, and affliction. And we see her there, a widow. And now her only son has died. She has no husband with whom to share this great grief. We're told at the end of verse 12 that much people of the city was with her. No doubt they're there to give her support, to try to provide some comfort and be of some help to her. But the truth is, they're all powerless to change her situation. None can change her situation. None of them, including herself, could reverse the situation. This is something that was beyond the control of every single person in that procession. Nothing they could do. Each step brings them closer to a very dreadful moment. In a funeral, there's various stages. You have, in our culture, a visitation. And that's a grief in itself when that family first walks in. Though death is real, it's even more real when they first walk in that funeral home room. You get through the visitation. Then, of course, you have the funeral service in our culture. And then you have the trip to the cemetery, which is really a dreaded thing. And then you get to the cemetery. And then you walk with the casket to the place of burial. They're all different. And they all have a little different sorrow. So there they are in this funeral procession, getting closer and closer to the cemetery, which of course there will take place the burial of her only son. So as they're getting closer to the cemetery, unknown to her, each step of that funeral procession brought her closer to a life-giving Savior. But as you look at this procession, it's a very sad scene. The only son of a widow being carried to his burial place. This is a sideline. We see funeral processions. You're out on the highway and you see a funeral procession. I try to pray when I see a funeral procession. First of all, you ought to pull over. You ought to pull over. Get out of the way. And you ought to pray. Lord, help those people. They need it. They really do. But that's a side note. So this widow woman, who's lost her husband, now deprived of her only son. In those days, her future now is very bleak. Again, she'd walked this road before. But it's different now. Because as long as her husband lived, she had someone who would take care of her. And she would have a home and she would be provided for. But when he died, she still had a son. A son that would be able to take care of her in time. We don't know how old he was at this time. Probably wasn't taking care of her at this time. But she had that in her future. My son will take care of me. But when he died, all of that has changed. And now though she's surrounded by people, she feels a loneliness that she never felt before. As you look at her, she's probably physically and emotionally drained. She's in a place of great distress, place of weakness, place of helplessness, and in her case, a case of hopelessness. But then notice Jesus arrives. Two processions. One of misery, going out of the city, heading to the cemetery. The other procession is led by Jesus. And they're going into the city. And they come nigh to the gate of the city. And these two processions on entirely different missions, with entirely different frames of mind, they meet. And it's no accident. This widow woman, in her broken and grief-stricken state, she's sorrowful and mourning, lost in her own world, probably did not even notice Jesus. You go to a cemetery the day of a burial of a loved one, a spouse, a child, whatever. You don't notice a lot of things. There's a lot of things you don't notice. And even when you look back on that day, you just didn't notice things. You knew there were people there, but you didn't really notice. You're in a world all by yourself. So she probably didn't even notice when the one procession approached the other. But that's not what's important. He noticed her. And we read in verse 13 that he saw her. He saw her, a heartbroken widow woman deprived of her only son. He saw her with an eye of knowledge. He knew her. Knew everything about her. He knew that her husband had died, and now her son. He knew her state of mind at this time. He knew everything that she was feeling, and he knew all of her needs. She did not know him, but he knew her. He saw her. He saw her with an eye of empathy. He knew, he understood, and he felt. Her fear, her sorrow, her distress, her misery, her grief, her pain, her disappointment, her emptiness. These two processions meet, and he saw her. A woman suffering the effects of the curse of sin. Death is one of the effects of the curse of sin. Well, there are many in that procession, but it is specifically stated in verse 13 that the Lord saw her. It is stated that he had compassion upon her. You'll notice the word her, that personal pronoun is used 3 times in verse 13. It's not necessary to use it 3 times. But there's an emphasis here. He saw her. He saw her. And it could read, and had compassion. But no, it had compassion on her. And it could read, and said, but it is said unto her. So Jesus sees her. So there's he and there's her. He and her. He, the very Son of God, God himself in a body of flesh. And there is her, an unworthy, helpless sinner. And it says he had compassion on her. Perfectly knowing this woman's past, her present, and even her future. And he felt within himself, he had compassion on her. He felt within himself a feeling of pity and sympathy, concern, and love. He had compassion on her. And as Jesus approaches the woman, the people must be thinking, who is this? What's he doing? And then he speaks to her and said unto her. He's not addressing the procession, he's addressing her. She's on her way to bury her only son. Her husband has already passed. She is overwhelmed with sorrow, and Jesus says to her, weep not. Weep not. Considering the circumstance, those seem to be very strange words. Considering the circumstance, they appear to be even inappropriate words. Now, we know they're not, but just from appearance. Considering the circumstance, these words, weep not, appear to be unfeeling and indifferent. And if you were to go to a funeral home and go in the day of visitation and tell the widow or whoever has experienced the loss through death, stop crying. That's not going to be well received. That's not the thing you say. But he says, weep not. But he does so with compassion, because he had compassion on her. And I don't believe that he's condemning or rebuking her for weeping or expressing sorrow. But with compassion, her pain in his heart, he says, weep not. Weep not. He was assuring her, as only he can. Basically, I believe what he's saying is the help you need is here. Everything is going to be okay. You don't need to cry anymore. That's what he's saying. Now, you can go to a funeral. I've seen it happen. It's almost unbelievable what some people say. But they'll say, everything will be okay. Well, you don't know that. You're not God. Everything will be okay. But Jesus could say that. Jesus could come and tell this woman, everything you need is here. There's no need to weep. The one who can was there. And I believe when Jesus said to her, weep not, even though she didn't know who he was, she felt the tone of compassion in his voice. She could see it in his eyes. And I believe a peace that passeth understanding came upon her at that very moment. And I believe she stopped weeping then and there. She knew all is well. All is well. Weep not. Jesus has interrupted this procession in a way that only he can. And Jesus has come for her. Again, in verse 13, 3 times the personal pronoun her. He's there for her. She's the one he's there for. And without the grief-stricken widow woman or anyone else in that procession asking for anything or throwing themselves at Jesus' feet pleading, we're told in verse 14, and he came and touched the bier. So he first goes to the woman, speaks to her. She's probably in front of the bier. And then he turns, goes to the bier, and touched the bier. And when he did, it says, they that bare him stood still. Everything is stopped. And with the entire funeral procession at a standstill, Jesus has his hand upon the bier. He speaks to the widow's only son, who is dead and is wrapped and bound in grave clothes. And he says, young man, I say, 2 very important words. I say. That's the power. That's the authority. Anyone else in that procession could have said the same thing. It wouldn't have mattered. But Jesus says, I say unto thee, again, it's personal, arise. Arise. And we read in verse 15, and he that was dead, life had been miraculously imparted, and as a result, he sat up. He didn't become alive when he sat up. That's not possible. He became alive when Jesus said, I say unto thee, arise. Jesus imparted life, and he arose. He sat up. I believe he sat up instantly. I don't believe there was any struggle. I believe he sat up completely. And for him to do so, he had to come out of what was holding him. Death, and also those grave clothes. He came out. And he did so by the power of Christ. And then we read, and began to speak. There was a transformation. And this was immediately manifest and visible. There are people today who want you to believe that they've passed from death unto life, but there's no evidence whatsoever. There was manifestation that this young man was now alive. And just imagine what the people thought when this young man sat up, free. And then Jesus, notice what it says, delivered or brought and took him unto his mother. What a scene. He gets up off that plank, and Jesus walks him over to his mother. And mother and son, no doubt, embrace. Imagine the reunion. And it's all because of Jesus. The entire scene has changed. And it's all because of Jesus. All the distress, all the agony, all the grief, all the anxiety, all the fear, all the dread of this widow mother is now turned to joy and exultation. All because of him. All because of Jesus, there was unspeakable joy. All because of Jesus, death was transformed into life. All because of Jesus, this young man was set free from death, set free from the grave clothes. And this young man is now a monument of what Jesus can do. And he could testify the rest of his life, because of Jesus I am. That could be his testimony the rest of his life. That should be our testimony as well. Because of him, I am. Someone asks you, why do you go to church every Sunday? Why do you go to church every Wednesday? And say, well, I was raised that way. That's the wrong answer. Because of him. Because of the Lord. Because of what the Lord has done in my life. So this young man could have that as a testimony. That day, Jesus interrupted a dreary and sad funeral procession and manifested his transforming power. And then notice verse 16. And there came fear and awe, and they glorified God. What was a mournful funeral procession is no longer. Now these people are glorifying God. And it's all because of Jesus. Now the application is so obvious for you and I. But again, it follows the miracle of the healing of the centurion's servant. And you put those two miracles together, it shows that Jesus is willing to reach every spectrum of society. Rich, poor, high, low, men, women. This particular miracle shows that he's greater. He's greater than any situation, any condition. He's greater than any circumstance, any problem. He's greater than any difficulty and any trial and any affliction, and greater than any need. He is the living, conquering, triumphant, overcoming one. And we've all experienced that over and over in our lives. We experienced it at salvation. We've experienced it over and over and over throughout our saved lives. So whatever is going on in our lives, He can. He can. He can transform any situation. He can approach and interrupt whatever is going on in your life. And that ought to always be our prayer, that He would. We ought to want Jesus Christ to interrupt our lives. It's always a good interruption, because He's the one who can make a difference. Jesus is greater than whatever is going on in anyone's life. And He can. And He can. So we ask you today, can you identify with this woman? Can you identify with her? Jesus coming and interrupting your life and bringing comfort. More importantly, can you identify with her Son? Has there been a time? Was there a day when Jesus came to you and you were dead, and He imparted life, and immediately you manifested that life? That needs to be so. We ought to be glad. We ought to praise Him and thank Him that one day He came to us and He made a difference that only He can make. But then we ought to thank Him that doesn't stop there. He continues. to come. He continues to interrupt our lives and make a difference, as only He can. So we pray that we can identify with both this widow and with her son. Brother Ben, if you'd come and lead us in a verse of song.